Okay, good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for the session, which is a follow-up to our 101 session that we had last week. Happy to see a great number of participants again today, and we're looking forward to another interactive dialogue. So please remember to make use of the chat box and the Q&A. We're going to dive right into it today. A few people will continue to start joining, but hopefully we can catch them up as we go. Just as a reminder, you have two of us with you today, and that means one of us is always busy typing and getting to your Q&A, so please don't hesitate to provide us any answers or ask for any clarity as we go. So myself from the UN SSE initiative, I'm Tiffany, and then we have Davide here today too. Hi, good morning, Davide, who's from CDP. So we'll be with you for the full 2 hours today. And so what are we going to do in these 2 hours? So the first hour will be really deep diving into those TCFD recommendations that we introduced to you last session. So we gave a quick kind of overview last time of what they are, how you might want to use them, why they were developed, and the kind of end goal, the North Star of getting them into your financial reporting at the end point. So we're going to take some examples and we're going to look at what does that look like in practice. And that will be at least half of today's session. We'll give you another break today about the halfway point for 5 minutes just to get up and move around. And then for the second half of today's session, we're going to look at how you can get this started, the internal processes you can use, how you can overcome certain challenges that you might be facing. And we'll do another exercise together where we're looking at a few examples and kind of discussing together what's good about it, what's bad about it, how we could improve it, etc., so that you can apply these examples to your own reporting. Again, we'll try to save time for Q&A at the end. Sometimes that gets eaten up because we answer questions throughout, but please don't hold your question till the end. Feel free to put it in as you're going, and then we'll address any we haven't addressed at the very end. Same housekeeping as last time. You're all on mute currently. However, if we do have time at the end to open up your microphones and have a quick Q&A at the end, we will. We will share the materials from this presentation at the end, just like last time. If you did not get an email after last time with the link to the slides as well as the survey, just check your junk mail first, because often that's where it might end up. And then if you can't find it, then you can reach out to us. Let's dig right into what we're doing today. This is that middle box, the TCFD 102. I already have a question. Hi, how many more modules for today's session? So this is, I think if you mean modules, you mean what we're talking about right now, but please clarify if this isn't what you were asking. This is the second of 2 programs. However, after you finish today, while we won't have live kind of interactive sessions like we're doing now with you on this topic anymore, because you finished this program, we will move on to the 102E, which is where you can do it yourself. You move at your own pace. It's self-guided, and you can choose kind of the specific topics you need to dive into where you need a little bit more support. So Davide is going to go through all of that at the end with you and explain where to go from here. So today we have kind of 3 key learning objectives we hope to get through with you. One is, of course, to build a detailed understanding of what are the TCFD recommendations and how to achieve practical implementation. So how to align your own reporting with these recommendations. We also hope that you leave understanding kind of what does good practice look like, so that you yourself can read others' reports too and get ideas, but also see what maybe what's missing and put yourself in the report reader's perspective. And then, of course, identify those processes needed internally. We really talked about this a lot last time, how it's not just about the final report, it's about all the processes that happen behind the scenes to make sure that you don't have any blind spots to any risks and opportunities that have real material financial impact on your organization that come from climate change and the climate more generally. With that, oh, can't forget our guidance. So we do reference this a lot. It's in your chat now. We're going to be covering chapters 3 and 4 of our model guidance on climate disclosure today. So what we're really looking at is what do you want to disclose and what should it look like when you're disclosing it. So that content and the presentation and validation will be today's main focus. So with that, I'm going to launch a poll because we'd like to get a bit of a gauge of where you're all at, where you need the most help with, what you might find the most daunting. So which of the TCFD core elements do you find the most challenging to implement, or would you like us to focus the most time on today? This just helps us to make sure we give enough time to that particular section. And because Davide is going to be taking us through these 4 elements, maybe I'll pass on to you, Davide.
Sure, thank you, Tiffany, and thank you everyone for attending and showing your interest in further building your knowledge of TCFD and climate-related reporting more in general. I see that as it often happens, most of the doubts are about metrics and targets, which makes sense, and they are not necessarily the easiest topic to understand straight away. But we do hope that by the end of today, you'll have a clearer idea of what we mean by metrics and targets and how and what metrics and targets you should be focusing on. So moving on, we are now going into a deeper dive into the specific recommendations of the TCFD. But we want to start with an overview. You have seen this image at the last training last week. We wanted to emphasize how all the elements of TCFD are interconnected, how they all form part of a single set of activities that will lead to a goal, and all of them are dependent on the others, because you cannot have proper risk management without having an idea of the metrics and targets that you'll be using. You cannot have a strategic approach when you have not identified the main risks that are material to your business. And of course, governance underpins it all. And having good governance processes within the company will help gathering targets, having better risk management, etc. One other thing that we would like to highlight, and we can use our first case study for this, is how these activities being interconnected do not work in silos. When you're doing your climate reporting, you should not be focusing on governance first. Then once you consider the governance ended, stop working on governance and move into strategy, and then move to risk management. It is not it is the way of achieving a complete climate-related disclosure is to treat all these elements together. And you can see here from the company Lend-Lease that they have started with their governance by strengthening the board, by establishing cross-functional TCFD steering committee. But at the same time, they started working on the strategy as well. And they've continued working on governance in the second year while ratcheting up the work on strategy. And also, now we've only used one slide, but if you went on, you could see that risk management and metrics and targets as well have started while the other activities were still ongoing. So one feeds into the other, and we would like to emphasize this. Moving on to the actual first key element of TCFD disclosure that we will encounter, it is governance. Governance concerns the organization's approach to governing climate-related risks and opportunities, both at the board and at the management level. The reason why investors want to know about governance is that they want to get context about how the organization approaches and embeds financial risks into its operations in terms both of structure of the operations and the company and overall approach to these topics. Investors in particular want to see that the proper level of attention is being given by the board and the management to climate-related issues in their operations. So to go further down, the first disclosure requirement in the governance is to disclose the role of the board of the organization in overseeing climate-related issues. Here, you might want to consider including a discussion on the processes and the frequency by which the board considers climate change. So, for example, are there particular board committees that focus on the topic or consider it? How often are these items on their agenda? What role do these committees play within the wider governance of the company? And for the overall board, you want to disclose information about whether the board considers climate-related issues when reviewing the company's strategy, its risk management procedures and policies, its expenditures, etc. And how are climate risks and opportunities factored into decisions from the board? And also, how does the board monitor and oversee the progress against targets that may have been set for setting climate-related issues? The second aspect, under governance, instead focuses on the role of management in assessing and managing climate-related issues, as opposed to the role of the board. The TCFD recommendations refer to management as any level of senior governance below board level. So as you can see, it is quite a wide-ranging description. And here you will want to consider a discussion of what specific individual roles and committees and functions have oversight of climate change at the management level, how they fit together with the company's organizational structure, how they are kept informed of climate-related issues, how they monitor these climate-related issues and the performance the performance measures that they would consider with regards to these topics. And also, you will remember that last week we discussed and we highlighted that working on climate disclosure may help develop the connections between management and board, management and directors. And so another thing that you might want to discuss is how are management and board connected? How does the management inform the board decisions? And how are board decisions communicated to the management to be enacted? An example of good practice on this is the company PLTD, where you can see that in their reporting, the governance structure is outlined visually. There are identifications of the committee and the members that are responsible for climate change and sustainability, more at large. The current approach to governance is outlined, and the specific committees and the roles of the specific committees are outlined, and the rationale for the approach, and also the specific duties of the committee for sustainability is outlined in line with what has already been done. Moving on, we have another case study just to reinforce this idea. Here too, you see that the governance structure is outlined in a visual way. The committees with specific accountability in relation to environment and climate change are specified and highlighted. And also the roles and the responsibilities of the committees are broken out, providing an explanation of how and who has oversight, can set the strategy, etc. Moving on, the second pillar under TCFD is strategy. Strategy relates to the actual or the potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on the organization's business, on its strategy, on its business planning, where such information is material. We will see and we will repeat often, we have repeated often in the first session as well, this idea that climate-related risks and opportunities are business risks and opportunities, and they should be treated as such where they are deemed material. So what do investors want to know here? Well, they want to have clarity about the alignment of the risks and opportunities identified as material to the company's wider strategy. So there is a close connection between the risk management part and the strategy part. One feeds into the other, and the strategy part shows how these risks and opportunities are addressed in a strategic manner. You will need to show the alignment of the company's business model to a low carbon future and the goals that it wants to achieve. Under strategy, one of the aspects is that of scenario analysis, which you have heard us talk about, and we will go a bit more in depth in a moment. To start, the first element under strategy is for the organization to describe the climate-related risks and opportunities identified over the short, medium, and long term. You will remember that last week we stressed the importance of highlighting and attaching time values to these time horizons. What do short, medium, and long term mean? They cannot be the same for all companies. The TCFD recommendations themselves highlight the fact that they are different for each company because each company is in a different situation. So you will have to identify your own specific time horizons, but try to disclose them because it helps whoever reads to understand. Then disclosing what material opportunities and risks have you identified for each of these time horizons. And how do you determine what financial impact do you expect from the opportunities and the risks you have identified? The second element focuses on describing the impact of climate-related risks and opportunities on your organization's business, on its strategy and its financial planning. Here, it involves quantifying and qualifying the particular impacts that you face from climate-related risks. So you may want to consider how the impacts from climate change affect your products and services. What are the expected impacts on your supply chain and wider value chain? What, if any, adaptation and mitigations activities have been taken into considerations and how they are going to be addressed? How climate change is informing your investment in research and development? And finally, how you see these impacting your operations, including an analysis of the types of operations and locations of facilities that you may encounter, that you may have. Of course, there are different risks, especially physical risks, but also transition risks for different kinds of activities. And so a specific explanation for the different types of activities is really useful. For an example, we have here CIMB, which provides readers with a visual disclosure of the risks that have been identified, and then the transmission channels by which these risks could influence the bank specifically in this case. And on the next page, the financial risks connected to these issues are identified. The time horizons are directly mapped to each risk, and the strategic approach also to these transmission channels is explained. And again, this goes to show the connection between risk management and strategy. The third and final element under strategy, we have another case study, which I tend to forget about. Here again, Deloitte identifies the climate-related risks, including physical risks, products and services, reputational risks, and policy risks, and described the impacts and the potential financial implication of each of these risks. Again, linking the risks that have been identified as material, what the financial implications are, and what the strategic approach to dealing with these risks is. Moving on now to the final element under strategy, scenario analysis. Scenario analysis, or better, the third element under strategy, focuses on disclosing the resilience of the organizational strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree or lower scenario. So the aim is to consider disclosing how does the business use climate-related scenarios to inform its strategy and financial planning. What are the scenarios and associated time horizons that have been identified? And what are the implications of different policy assumptions, different macroeconomic trends, energy pathways, and the technology assumptions that have been used in the climate-related scenarios, and how resilient is the organization's strategy with regards to these assumptions, these trends, etc. We'll now go a bit more into the details about what scenario analysis is, because we understand that it can be a bit more challenging to understand as a concept. We want to start by highlighting that scenario analysis is not a prediction of future performance. The TCFD recommendations do not ask you to see the future and to predict exactly what is going to happen. Scenario analysis is a method for developing strategic plans that are more flexible or robust to a range of plausible future states. What is important is to look at alternatives and think beyond what is business as usual for strategic planning. A scenario is a pathway that the business believes is plausible, is not necessarily what the business expects to see, but it is still possible that is going to happen, or it is not what the business sees as desirable. The whole concept of scenario analysis is considering potential alternatives and considering how the company's strategy, as it is at the moment, is resilient, whether it is or not, to these issues, to these scenarios. It is a tool that helps you enhance your critical strategic thinking, and to be effective should be a narrative based on a number of scenarios, because it allows you to try and understand what might happen and how you might react with different outcomes, different futures. And what is really important is not the credibility of the results of the analysis. Again, it is not about predicting future performance. It is about the possible responses that you envision for your business from these expected futures. So you can see here that there is a number of possible climate scenarios. There are many different ways that climate change can play out over the next century, depending on the actions that we as a society take. And an ambitious scenario would be to achieve 1.5 degrees of warming, but that will depend on significant emission reductions in the near term and the write out over the remainder of the century. However, on current policies, we are going towards a 3 to 3.4 degrees Celsius warming, which has, of course, massively different outcomes and massively different effects. So what scenario analysis allows us to do is to think about different responses that we may have for the various scenarios. So what our emission targets will be, what the energy mix will be affecting our business under the different scenarios. We can expect on 1.5 degrees consistent scenario, there will be a much higher level of renewables, for example. So how will that affect your business? What shifts in consumer behavior and demands we can expect and we can see. And it is, we understand it is not the easiest thing to visualize. We cannot expect you to be scientists, to be climatologists. We are not climatologists ourselves. So we can rely on the work that has been done by others, like, for example, the Network for Greening the Financial System or the International Energy Agency, who have provided us with scenarios, with guidance on how to apply these scenarios. And you can find them in the material that is provided with this course. For example, page 27, if I remember correctly, of the climate guidance, you can find a list of possible scenarios that you could use. And this will help you. This will help you understand what this is all about and how to apply this to your business. Moving on, scenario analysis is an iterative process. Now, I saw in the questions, in the Q&A, in the chat, that there was one question about how in-depth and granular scenario analysis should be. The TCFD recommendations understand that it is a long-term process. It is not necessarily something that happens from one day to the other. Companies can start choosing qualitative scenario narratives or storylines that help them explore the potential range of climate change implications. And then over time, while the data that the company gathers gets better, while the internal processes get better, while the science about climate change gets better as well, a company, an organization can start fine-tuning these scenarios. You can start using quantitative information, more granular information to illustrate the potential pathways and outcomes. You can start using more greater rigor and more sophistication in the use of the data sets that you use. And so grow the accuracy of your scenario, all the while remembering our mantra here that that scenario analysis does not require you to predict future performance. So it can be a very detailed, and it should be as detailed as possible. But again, you're not expected to see the future and predict the future. An example that we have of a scenario analysis that has been carried out and can be useful is from Allianz. Here we have a heat map showing various time horizons, various asset types, various risk levels and factors that may enhance or mitigate potential risk exposures. And it includes scenarios for 2 degrees Celsius warming and 1.5 degrees. And it clearly shows a timeline. It shows what kind of risk can be identified and how these are connected to the company's strategy. And it's quite a good visual way of visualizing the analysis. We also have another case study from, I thought we had one. We'll provide you with others afterwards. So let's move on to the a poll. Let's see whether we have been clear enough, or maybe we should have added more case studies. Which of the followings are true of scenario analysis? You can select more than one here, and it can be both qualitative and quantitative. It supports the development of flexible and robust strategies. Its aim is to predict future business performance. Multiple scenarios should be considered, or it is the same as science-based targets.
Davide, maybe we can address a few questions
Yep, sure.
while people answer this. One question, well, there are many good questions. One of them was about divestment as part of this strategy to, say, achieve net zero, which I think is important to move into that. Did you want to dig into divestment at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Divestment is a very interesting topic. What some find interesting, others might find boring, but it's very salient to these issues, because there is divestment is a strong weapon in the hands of an investor. It is something that should be kept in the arsenal of the investor as a possibility, and there should be clear KPIs or metrics that trigger divestment. So it should not be an empty threat. At the same time, we do not believe that divestment directly is the best choice, because unfortunately, if you want to say it, pure divestment doesn't really solve the problem, because the company's shares, for example, will be very likely bought by someone else who might not be as interested. So there is a strong case to be made for engagement with the companies, voting at AGMs, putting forth resolutions at AGMs, and working with the company to increase through both direct or single engagement or collective engagement through various initiatives that exist.
Yeah, and I think I'd just add that from a TCFD perspective, we really want to look at it for what financial material impact does it have. So as you said, not an empty threat. Don't do it. TCFD doesn't want you to do it just for the sake of making a statement, but rather they want you to do the financial analysis around it and determine if it's a smart financial move to divest. And how you do that is you analyze the risk associated to those companies that make up your assets. So it could be a good strategy, but it's not one that's a good strategy unless you've analyzed the financial impact of it. And then someone's added on, what about divestment as the company's strategy, not from the perspective of the investor? Yeah, I think that's the same. Like you have to do the financial analysis around it. So if your portfolio is heavily weighted to the carbon sector, and you think that maybe it might make sense then for you as a company to start divesting, or even say, let's just say it's in your value chain and you need to kind of take into account that risk. That's what the TCFD helps you do, is to do that risk analysis and determine what changes in those companies, in the policy impacting those companies, in their costs, etc., will have a knock-on effect on your financial position and your financial statements. So it really comes down to that risk analysis, I think.
And since we are talking about these, I'll throw to you a question that has just come. What about lower reinvestment instead of divestment?
Yeah, I mean, great. Like that would be a good, if you did the analysis and determined that, okay, actually, if we divested from all of our portfolio, this also wouldn't be a very good business decision for us. Where do we shift our money then? Or if say it's not from the investor perspective, but more looking at your value chain, you can't simply remove a chunk of your value chain and not have any supply coming in then. So yeah, indeed, the idea of particularly a scenario analysis is kind of taking you through kind of multiple years of changes and looking at how you can adjust your strategy. You know, in someone's case, they said, well, if IPCC says, you know, we can't go beyond 1.5, why should we even bother looking at 4? So the road to 4 is long. The road to 4 is not happening from today to tomorrow. There's many years in between today and 4 degrees. And in that process, you can determine how long your business survives in that process, and how resilient your business is to the, you know, year by year changes that we're going to be seeing. So it really comes down to resilience. How do we make sure that our companies are going to withstand the changes that are happening, not only to your own company, but to the companies you invest in, to the companies that invest in you, to the value chain and the supply chain that you're a part of. Everybody's going through slightly different changes, different pressures, political pressures, as well as customer pressures. The customer trends are changing a lot. So it's really just making sure that you're on top of these changes as they're coming. And maybe just to address one more while we're at it, someone was asking about how often we should conduct a scenario analysis. So starting to just type into that, but do you want to discuss timing now?
Well, it should be, as we said, it should be an iterative process. So it should be carried out potentially annually, upgrading it and updating it. I think the recommendation is that it's going to take you some time to achieve a proper scenario analysis, between 3 and 5 years. I'm looking at Tiffany because she's the person that knows the times perfectly.
No, I agree. I mean, I was writing that the first year is always the biggest investment in terms of identifying those scenarios, kind of what are the scenarios that are best for your company to use. And that can be a bit of an investment in terms of time. However, once you've set them out and you've looked at how they impact all your business and every part of your business, it's kind of like a check-in, you know, a yearly check-in to make sure that these scenarios are still relevant to your organization, updating any of the data, the scientific data that's come out since, and then just having a quick check if any of those changes then had an additional impact on your business. But it's not, you know, doing the whole thing every year. It's really getting it started and then using it as kind of a check and balance point.
Very good. So moving on, we have a good number of responses, and we can say that yes, scenario analysis can be both qualitative and quantitative. It does support the development of flexible and robust strategies, and as we have seen in the case studies, multiple scenarios should be considered. Number 3 is not correct, because the aim of scenario analysis is not to predict future business performance. We cannot expect to see the future and be so specific. We can just think about how our organization might respond to future scenarios. And 5 as well is not correct, because scenario analysis is not the same as science-based targets. Science-based targets focus on charting a pathway along a Paris-aligned mitigation route, so along a certain goal in line with the Paris Agreement, to reduce the impact of the organization on the climate, whereas climate scenarios focus on understanding the risks and opportunities to the business and the resilience of the business's strategy under different scenarios. So one is more outward looking, whereas the other one is more inward looking. Moving on further to the third pillar of TCFD, risk management. This focuses on disclosing the organization's, how the organization identifies, how it addresses, and how it manages climate-related risks. Investors want to see what the processes are that the organization is using and how it is seeing the influence on business strategy and financial planning from these risks. It is important to investors because they need to be able to understand the impacts of climate risks on a company's business model and think how business can adapt to take advantage of opportunities. The first disclosure regards what processes an organization has to identify and assess climate-related risks. So you want to consider including a discussion of how you determine the relative significance of the climate related risks versus the other risks that have been identified as material, whether you consider for example, the emergence or already the existence of regulatory requirements with regards to climate change, and how these will impact your organization in the long term. Also, if you use any particular risk classification to inform your climate thinking, you will want to disclose these as well in order to allow the reader, to help the reader understand better what your thought process was and your procedures were. The second recommended disclosure focuses on describing the organization's processes for managing climate-related risks. Here, helpful information includes what decisions does the organization make and what has been made about these risks. Will these risks be mitigated? Will they be transferred? Will they be accepted? Will they be controlled? How do you prioritize climate-related risks? And how have you decided on which risks are material for your business under the criteria that you have identified for materiality? The last aspect of risk management is describing how the processes for identifying, for assessing, and for managing climate-related risk are integrated into the company's overall risk management. So here you will want to consider including a discussion of whether climate risk is considered as a business risk altogether, what the materiality of climate risks is for the organization, and if they are materials, should they be reported specifically with a focus on these specific risks. An example of a useful climate-related risk management disclosure is from the company Cemex, where you can see that climate-related risks are a part of the company's wider risk assessment. There is a visualization of the management's role in identifying, in assessing and monitoring and mitigating climate-related risks, how these are connected between and included under the company's wider risk management processes. And it is explained in the narrative how this risk management process is carried out. Moving on, the last pillar under TCFD regards metrics and targets, which we have seen are a bit more of a complicated issue to focus on. So here you will disclose the metrics and the targets are used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities where such information is material. So investors want to know the connection between the company's wider strategy and its business model. And in the long term, what are the performance trends and what the company is really doing to address this progress. Specifically, the first metric, the first element under metrics and targets focuses on disclosing the metrics used to assess climate-related risks and opportunities in line with the company's strategy and its risk management process. So you will want to include a discussion of which performance metrics are used to assess and manage the financially material climate-related risks and opportunities. You will want to identify, for example, if you have identified opportunities to grow the products and services linked to low carbon services and technologies, you need to think about how you're going to report these revenues, what capital investing is made to realize these opportunities. And one thing that you might want to consider is to adopt an internal carbon price. This has been and shown to be really valuable for companies to assess the impacts of possible future carbon taxation and CDP has put out, I see, what does an internal carbon price mean as a question. It is it does what it says on the tin, basically. A company assigns a certain price in dollars or whatever currency you might want to use to each ton of carbon that is used within the company's processes. This will help you understand, say, for example, that a tax on GHG emissions, on carbon emissions, is applied in the future. You will be able to understand what impact it will have on your company, or it will help you understand how a focus on lower carbon intensive processes, products and services might help you save money or might redirect investments in a certain way, how investments in this type of technologies compared to others might have an effect on your bottom line eventually. So it can be quite useful. And again, we will provide you with a report that CDP put out last year about internal carbon pricing that will guide you and help you understand how it is used, what it means, and where it is mostly developed. So this is going to be useful for you. The TCFD guidance emphasizes 7 categories of metrics that are intended to support comparability, because here we need to remember that one of the main advantages of climate-related disclosure is ensuring comparability and being able to compare the metrics and the disclosure from the companies. So some cross-industry climate-related metric categories include GHG emissions with absolute scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and emission intensity, transition risks, physical risks, the climate-related opportunities that have been identified, the capital deployment, again, internal carbon prices, where possible, if applied, and the proportion of executive management remuneration that is linked to climate considerations. These are all very useful to include as metrics to help compare between different companies. Moving on, the second aspect on the metrics and targets focuses specifically on the disclosure of scope 1, scope 2, and if appropriate, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. You will remember that last week, Tiffany highlighted the fact that the latest iteration of the recommendations focuses quite strongly on scope 3 as well, because it is being increasingly recognized that it is an important and relevant topic, and also the related risks that are connected to these emissions. So following the greenhouse gas protocol, you will want to disclose the greenhouse gas emissions broken down in the scopes aligned to the greenhouse gas protocol, and there are tools to support you with scope 3 calculations and scope 3 development that we can then link in the chat. We want to provide a description of the value chain activities, so the scope 3 activities that are relevant for the business and the emissions associated with them, or whether you have plans to calculate these, what the plans are. And also the relevant methodologies, the estimation techniques, and any data gaps for the greenhouse gas calculations, because the recommendations recognize that scope 3 especially, but not only scope 3, can be quite challenging to achieve and to provide. So it is not forbidden, in inverted commas, to use estimations to highlight that there are data gaps, because there is a realization that there are data gaps. But this should be highlighted, and it should be made possible for whoever reads these reports to understand where those are and what the estimation techniques used are. The final aspect is describing the targets that are used by the organization to manage climate-related risks and opportunities, and the performance against these targets. So what performance metrics are you using to assess and to manage the financially material climate-related risks and opportunities? Do you measure climate-related opportunities, such as, for example, the revenue from products and services specific for a low-carbon economy? And again, has the company established an internal carbon pricing? We understand that targets may be again another slightly complicated issue. So the guidance provides more specific details about the relationship between metrics and targets and the characteristics of effective climate-related targets. So effective climate-related targets are aligned with the strategy and the risk management goals of the company. They are linked to relevant metrics. They are quantified and they're measurable. They are clearly specified over time. So they specify a baseline, they specify a time horizon, and provide some interim targets as well. They are understandable and they're contextualized to the specific company. They are periodically reviewed and updated. And there is a reporting annually against these targets and the interim targets as well. A case study that we can provide you to help you understand better how to disclose metrics and targets, and Tiffany if you can move, thank you, is from Adani Ports. Adani's disclosure is clear and transparent. Here it shows the trends over time and the relative contribution of the different types of emissions. Emission intensity is used and provided, highlighting and allowing the user to understand the trend over time. Scope 3 emissions are also clearly broken down by category, and for those as well, a time frame is provided. Now, a potential increase and potential upgrade of this or way of improving this is providing longer time frames for Scope 3 emissions. Now, in this case, it is possible that the company had not gathered the information before that year, but the longer time frame you provide, the most detail you provide, the easier it is to understand the trends and understand what the company is doing. And so the reader can be reassured that you are taking action. Just as a last wrap up, we wanted to highlight these to-do list that our colleagues at CDSB have created, which can be used by you to check whether your current or planned climate-related financial disclosures are effective. And so here are the main characteristics of these disclosures that make them effective, make them easy to understand, and make them useful for whoever reads these reports and uses these reports in making decisions. We have a poll now to see whether we have been clear enough. So you can select all that apply and which of the following are characteristics of effective climate disclosure. So are those specific to reporting entities? Are they presented in a separate climate risk report? Are they prepared accordingly to the same rigor as financial information? Or are they future-oriented?
And somehow we're right on time today, Davide.
Oh,
so
well done.
We'll actually make it on time. We might even have time for Q&A at the end. So that's great. Thanks for everyone whose questions are coming in.
let's keep, okay. Okay, so as a response, it is good to see that we have been clear enough. Yes, climate-related disclosures to be effective should be specific to the reporting entity. They should be prepared according to the same rigorous financial information, because as we have been saying, these are financial related climate disclosures, and they will be future oriented. They, in connection to the fact that these are material to the business, they are financially related, they should not be presented in a separate climate risk report. They can be presented in a second time in a report linked to the company's financial reports, which will allow whoever reads with a specific focus on climate to identify where the disclosures are. So that can be a useful tool, but the direct disclosure of financially material climate-related information should be in the company's financial reporting. Okay, now we have a moment's break to give you some 5 minutes to shake your legs, get a drink, and we can meet in 5 minutes. So 8:59, sorry, 5:59 for you.
Hopefully everyone had a chance to get up and move around briefly, but let's get back into how we get this started now. So thanks for all the really great questions, Davide. Thanks for taking us through those 4 key elements of the TCFD. And I think based on the questions, you know, there's some people who are already quite advanced on this and some people who are just starting. So let's look at kind of the various stages and how we either get started or move forward from where we already are. So some of the key areas that we want to look at is first and foremost leadership buy-in. No matter what stage you're at, it's important that both the report preparers and the leadership are kind of on the same stage and moving forward together on this process. So how do you get that started, or how do you progress with leadership buy-in? How do you include this in your mainstream report? We keep saying that's kind of the end goal of where we want to reach to. That said, it might not be where you start. It depends on where you are in this process. But the point of the TCFD is linking it to the financial impact that it has on your organization. So it should therefore end up in your financial filings at some point. So how do we get there? What should you start with? How do you use other standards and frameworks? And you know, why should you start on this if your peers or maybe others in your market are not? All important questions we would like to do here. So first and foremost, how do we get leadership buy-in? Now it looks like we did have a request for a recap from the last 1 hour, last session, the whole session. So we don't have time for that, but I do really recommend looking at the slides again. Also, really the key takeaways, maybe from last session and that last hour of the whole TCFD. Really the key takeaways are that this is meant to look at what is the financial impact of climate on your organization. In order to do that, we need to integrate it into our processes internally, into our risk management, into our strategy, and then of course into our governance. And then our targets and our metrics that are evaluating that have to connect it all as well. So there has to be kind of a connection between all of these. And that really often starts at the top. So if we want our board and our managers and our leaders in our organization to understand this, what do we need to present to them? Now, first and foremost, a lot of this pressure is coming from investors. We discussed last time how the TCFD was started by central bankers. It's from the financial sector. It's looking at financial risk and systemic risk. So really the first stage is usually looking at your investors. Who are your investors, and are they supporters of the TCFD already? You can check that on the TCFD supporter site. but also having a conversation with them. TCFD and climate in general is really requiring us to have a bigger conversation within our organization and beyond our organization. So talking to your investors, finding out what information they need and kind of how they're assessing climate can be a very important first step. Also, we talked also last week about the regulatory context and how we're moving into a mandatory zone here. Globally, governments have their own goals, and they're requiring then companies to start aligning their reporting so that we can collectively move forward on these goals. So providing that regulatory context, the investor context, and then finally your peers and your value chain context as well. So what are the practices happening around you, sector leaders? You can do a quick search on the TCFD hub to look at reports of other organizations, either in your industry or in your geographic region. We'll discuss what to do later if you're not finding much and maybe you're a leader in your industry or in your region. But it's important to see what others are doing to not be left behind, of course. Then once you've provided that context, it's important to kind of develop that understanding and to kind of build the knowledge within your organization. So arranging training for your board and your management, explaining the strategic and the financial implications of climate change, which we've spent a lot of time discussing, and identifying the potential climate-related opportunities for your organization. Now, a few of you said you weren't at the 101 session. So Davide, do you want to remind us of the CDPs? Do you remember the numbers offhand? There was risk versus opportunity, and the risks were in the billions and the opportunities were in the trillions. Is that correct?
Yes, it was exactly like that. It was 2.1 trillion of opportunities and 1. Or even less about the cost of taking action.
Okay, so the risks are what we've been focusing a lot, but it's important to note that those opportunities, the opportunity cost is also huge here. So making sure that, and that's what a lot of this, analysis helps you do, is to identify both the risks and the opportunities, and not to forget that side, the opportunities, when you're diving into this. Okay, so how do I include this in my mainstream report? This is a question we get often. And whenever we get the question, it's very pleasing, because that is the point. So at least that's kind of the way you're moving, is understanding that this is where it's supposed to be. First, it's important to note that a separate TCFD disclosure might be your starting point. While a lot of organizations are doing this already, if it is your starting point, it's important to note that it's a starting point. So often doing that through kind of a roadmap, which we've discussed last time, kind of setting out your plan moving forward of how you're going to get this information into your financial filings, which of course is doing the financial impact analysis. So once you've identified a risk or an opportunity as having a financial impact, that means that it should appear in your financial filings. So at the beginning, it's really important to work with all of the authors of the report and embedding that across your entire report. So one way you can do that is using a cross-reference table. I believe we have an example coming up too, and that will help you even to just start to map where all this information is in your report. We've provided it kind of, TCFD gives these 4 elements, or 4 pillars as we've been referring to them, but we keep mentioning that they're interlinked and they should be connected. So that means that you don't necessarily want just kind of a 4-chapter report with these 4 elements indicating kind of each of them. This will appear in your report where it makes most sense. So where you're talking about your board governance and your climate committees, that will anyways appear in the governance section of your report. However, that should link into the strategy. So in the strategy section, where you're discussing maybe a new strategic target that your government or that your organization has put forward, you will then have to kind of link back to the governance and explain how that's being governed. So A mapping of the different elements of TCFD can be helpful for anyone who's looking to find specific information, but more importantly, it's helpful for you to make sure that you've covered everything. You can also use the TCFD checklist in Annex 1 of the SSE's model guidance, which can help you kind of just check off what you already have in your reporting and note where it is. And that can be a helpful internal tool for you. So I'll always start with the content you already have, check where you're at, check what's missing. And I wouldn't say just do this on year one. This is a constant process. You don't create one report that you've aligned to TCFD and there you're done. Just like you need to keep checking in with your scenario analysis, risks, opportunities, they change. Business risks, business opportunities constantly change. So it's keeping up with it and making sure that you have all the processes in place. So here's an example of a cross-referencing table. So we see this quite commonly now, where you have kind of one column of the 4 elements, then broken down. These are the recommended disclosures that we've just gone through in the last hour. Davide's explained each one and we've given some examples. But then on the far right-hand column, you can see that they've provided kind of where you can find this information. So the URP or URD is their universal registration document. So that's their financial filings. But then they also reference, for example, the CDP questionnaire or other, like a sustainability report they might have where that information can be found. So this helps to show kind of also what they've already identified as being material to their organization and including it in their financial filings and other areas that they might be keeping an eye on. So how to get started. We went through a 3-phase approach last time. So that's the TCFD aligned kind of 3 phases that you might go through over 3 to 5 years when aligning your reporting to the TCFD recommendations and making sure that you're covering all the areas that they recommend. Here's another option, has a few more levels, but I think it also helps you to put yourself in the mindset of that process you're going through. The first stage being acknowledgement. So from unaware or not acknowledged to acknowledging simply is, explicitly recognizing that climate change has a significant issue for your business. And you can do this through implementing a policy for commitment to action on climate change and usually showing your support for the TCFD. So you can become an official supporter of the TCFD and be listed on their website. Kind of starting off with that statement from the top saying, we recognize it, we see this, we're working towards it. And often at that point, kind of setting your roadmap of how you're going to move forward with alignment. What can be helpful at that point also is to do that gap analysis, use maybe the checklist in the Annex 1 of the SSE document, or just go through each of the recommendations yourself and see what are we already addressing, what do we have, and how are we going to move forward on the rest. Then in level 2, moving through building capacity. We've had a lot of questions about, okay, what is an internal carbon price? How do we report on our GHG emissions for different scopes? What should we be doing first? So building up that capacity internally to understand what these different areas are, how they impact your business, making sure that it's integrated into your risk management, really regarding kind of the internal capacity of your organization. And then moving into integrating this into operational decision-making, really integrating it into what you're doing already, and then moving into a strategic level, making sure that your strategy, your forward-looking planning takes into account. That's really the resilience of your organization moving forward. And then how does this fit with other reporting standards and frameworks? So we discussed this also last week, but just to remind everyone that all of the main reporting frameworks that many of you we saw are already using in your market are mapped to the TCFD recommendations. And as a reminder, last week we discussed with you what of these frameworks might you be using already to get an idea, and the reason we discussed why we didn't put TCFD on that list, and that's because TCFD should, rather than be seen as a framework, kind of the presentation format that you should be using, it's seen more as the content that you should be addressing. So a number of these other frameworks also ask for this particular content, so they've been mapped to the TCFD. However, there are some things that exist in TCFD that aren't existing in other frameworks, so it's important to do this mapping exercise and look at the existing mappings that are out there in order to look at what you already have and what you need to build on top of. And that's also to note that a number of these frameworks are coming together now. So that makes it even easier, but as they're coming together, they're using those same 4 elements we've discussed. So making sure that you're addressing kind of through your governance, through your strategy, through your risk management, and through your metrics and targets, and making sure that they make sense and they're connected will not only help you with climate, but other sustainability issues as well. So we really recommend using the TCFD Knowledge Hub. Not only can you see what other organizations are doing, maybe those that are already using integrated reporting, how they're connecting that with their TCFD or GRI or CDP, but also we have a number of mappings on there that you can use already as you move forward. Okay, so, and the final question that we often get is, maybe this isn't such a big thing in our market. Our peers aren't doing this. It could look like, we're spending our resources on something that our peers aren't, and it might be a disadvantage. So how do we address that? So I think first and foremost, it's to look at why you're being asked to do this. And it's first and foremost that investors need this information to inform their capital allocation decisions. And therefore, by not disclosing this information, the absence of disclosure does not signal or indicate to investors that there's an absence or there is no climate risk facing your organization. It's now well understood that climate risk and opportunities are facing all organizations, but in different ways. So by providing this information, you're ensuring that it's an up-to-date analysis and that investors have all the information they need about how prepared or resilient you are for these coming changes in the future. Whereas if you're not providing this information, they'll be conducting their own analysis off of guesses, essentially. So they might do it based on what other organizations in other countries are doing, or maybe on what they expect to see as a change in your industry without taking into consideration how prepared you are for those changes. So it's really important that you're considering this not only from a everyone else is doing this is a trend moving forward thing, but rather from really a blind sight in our risks and opportunity assessment that has existed. And now we actually have the science to address this. So taking that into account and making sure that you're addressing it internally. Our final point on that slide is regarding mandatory disclosure. And that's, of course, we mentioned that this is a process that takes, 3 to 5 years. So as mandatory disclosure is coming, it is really important that this is something that you're already working on, because it's not something that you can implement from one reporting cycle to the next. It's always going to be a journey of integration. So getting started sooner is always better in the long run. But the key is just to get started. And so I think that's why we indicate quite a bit. This is a process. It's not even a process 3 to 5 years to get aligned to the TCFD recommendations, but then it's a continual process because we constantly see changes in our environment. We wouldn't have been able to predict, for example, the impacts of the COVID pandemic coming forward, but we can ensure our company is resilient enough to pivot and to react to these things as they're coming. So just a quick poll, again, just to make sure we're being clear and understood. So which of the following would be ways to integrate climate disclosures in a mainstream financial report? First option is to use a cross-referencing table to map to content. Second option is to add a small box on TCFD, but keep the details on your website. Third is to engage with authors from the different report sections. And fourth is to publish the information in a sustainability report for now as a starting point. So I'll leave that poll open for a moment. Davide, I saw you typing away. Is there anything you wanted to address out loud?
We managed to answer most of the questions, but I would like to throw one to you. How does TCFD align with integrated reporting? We go back to the last discussion.
That's a great question. I personally feel like the kind of ethos behind integrated reporting and TCFD are the closest of all the frameworks, given that integrated reporting is that idea of let's pull all this information into one report and show that connection to our financial impact. So that kind of almost saves a step of the financial impact analysis that we're doing. So I would say that maybe it's a little bit easier if you're already doing integrated reporting to move into the mindset of TCFD. However, that said, all the other reporting frameworks have been covering that space for a long time too, and they're already requiring kind of certain areas that TCFD requires because it's already been identified that they have a financial impact on organizations based on the sector you're in or the industry you're in, because most of them have kind of sector specific, industry specific guidance that they're given. So maybe it's not an advantage one or the other than maybe the mindset you're getting into when you start with it. With integrated reporting, the integration is already there.
And also, this may not be a question that is easy to answer directly, but in case you have anything off the top of your mind, Iskandar was asking if we would be able to guide them to an empirical data or analysis showing positive correlation between climate-related financial reporting and market capitalization of TIC, which is a very good question, very interesting one. I did link a study showing better access to capital for companies that provide proper structured disclosure on climate-related issues. In case you had anything or anything comes to mind, we can link it further to the in the chat here.
Yeah, that's a great question. It all comes down to methodology of each of the reports. So we can prove either. We can prove that it has an impact. We can prove that it doesn't. However, while this won't help you with the exact data you're looking at, I might pull from my academic roots and say that this is a conversation that's been happening in academia for many years now, not just for climate, but for sustainability more broadly, and more started kind of on the social space of really kind of what is the conditions in the factories, essentially, that mostly in the garment sector was where it kind of sparked this conversation. But since what the trend has been and the majority of the data has shown that indeed it does have a financial impact, and that companies that consider their more holistic long-term resilience of their organization do, of course, do better over time. That's been spiked recently because investors are caring a lot more about this now. Investors have a lot more information. And as you provide, as we just discussed, more accurate information, and you provide kind of more detail on how you're preparing your company for moving forward, this helps investors also take that into consideration. So I think that as we move forward, the data will become much more clear on that perspective. If I think of, while we're here, if I think of a really good article that might support that, I'll send it in the chat as well. Yeah. So I'm going to share the results now. So great. Cross-referencing table. Yes, that's usually not only very helpful for the readers of the report, but it's also helpful as you're preparing the report. So I think that's a very good tool to use. And then also engaging with the authors of the different report section number 3, 100%. It's something that'll have to be done anyways, because as we've noted, climate really hits kind of the full spectrum of the organization. So those two definitely for sure. The last one for publishing information, a sustainability report for now, yes, with the caveat of that's not the end goal, but can be a starting point. And then the one that had the least answers, adding a small box on TCFD, but keeping the details on your website. Indeed, I wouldn't recommend that, mostly because financial investors are not looking through your website in order to find this information. They want to see it connected to your financial report. So it could be useful maybe for you to speak with other stakeholders by putting this information on your website, but make sure that's not the only place because sometimes it's hard for stakeholders to find it there. And oh, I don't think I shared the results, but there you go. So with that, we're going to move into a discussion exercise. So we're going to take a moment. I know that was a lot to absorb. We're going to take you back to the first hour now, where we were discussing kind of what are these 4 elements and how might they look in practice with some examples. So we're going to share, you have now 3 examples. Choose one of them. And so you'll see an example number. I might actually go here. You can see all 3. So example 1, example 2, and example 3. The first one is looking at governance. So on page 17 of the City Development Limited Integrated Sustainability Report. And just to note that it's page 17 by the page numbers, but if you're just typing into the PDF, the page, I think it's page 20. So just take note of the page numbers on the bottom of each page. So that one, we're looking at the governance. And so what elements of that particular page are good based on our discussion today? What further information do you think they could have included? And have a think about what you might want to take from that and include in your own reporting. Same for example 2, strategy, Vodafone. That's pages 9 to 15. And then example 3 is Sunway, looking at metrics and targets. That's page 16. But again, if you're typing it in, on the PDF, it's the 20th page of the PDF. So just choose one of those. Have a moment to read through it, look at what they're doing, what you feel like is missing, what questions arise in your head about how they manage climate change in their organization, and then pop in the chat your answers to those 3 questions for the one example you've decided to look at. Just note what example you're referring to. We'll give you 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a discussion about each one of these reports. Okay, I'm just going to give maybe another 2 minutes for anyone who's already typing in their comments. I see a lot coming through, so give you 2 minutes to finish up your thought and type it in, and then we'll start discussing them. Okay, why don't we dig into these? We've got a lot of really great comments so far. So thanks everyone, and please feel free to keep them coming. We'll keep our eye on them as we can. Great. So quite a few of you looked at this first one, and a lot of the things I was seeing were quite positive. There were talks about how they discussed their long-term strategy. They also talked about linking appraisals to remuneration, which is very important. The committees that they have, particularly looking at sustainability and then specifically climate as well. One particular comment I liked from someone in the chat, which is long lost now because there's a lot in there, is that it really showed commitment from the top. And I think that's really important to note, that it's not just about like a tick box exercise here. TCFD asks for all of this, and this is why. The reason that the governance section of the TCFD recommendations does not have a materiality lens, or it's not asking only include what's financially relevant to your organization, is that it's all financially relevant. So if you were to include something in your strategy saying, you know, it's really important for us to be on top of climate change, but then your governance didn't reflect that, and the message from the top was that actually it's not that important to us. That's quite conflicting in the two areas of your report. So just making sure that there's consistency, and that really comes from kind of the messaging from the top. So good job to those noting that. A few of the things that people would like to include were more on the process. And I think we're with you on that. We also felt that they did a really good job of indicating the roles of relevant individuals and committees and the functions that they each do. That was quite clear. This visual diagram we can see now makes it very clear kind of the organizational structure. They also note the timing of when they at least report on their work. However, we did feel like we were still not fully understanding the process. So a detail of responsibilities and feedback mechanisms could be helpful to further understand this process. So just to give you an example of what that might look like, you know, for example, in this this chart, which again is just a quick, we try to pick ones that are visually easy to look at, but this can also be done in words, of course. So here they kind of indicate what are the main functions pertaining to climate. So the board of director is in charge of approving climate change initiatives. And then also they have arrows going in both directions to indicate kind of that this is a two-way communication, which Davide has mentioned kind of a few times is how we need to, this is a good opportunity to increase the communication and enhance the way we communicate. Also, just another note, as an example of specifying kind of roles and tasks, here's another way, another organization has done that. This is Nedbank. And they kind of look at the board's role is to monitor, approve, provide oversight, etc. And then the climate risk function has particular tasks that they've noted. And often we can also see kind of a yearly update of what happened in that year. So these committees, what did they approve? What did they not approve? What are the key KPIs they were working towards? How successful were they? Just an idea of what's actually happening in practice can be quite helpful to understand, as someone had indicated in the chat, that process that goes on. So good job, everyone. Let's move on to Vodafone. I've seen kind of a few more have been looking at the Vodafone Now. So that was a bit of a longer one. So you did well at analyzing that in such a short amount of time. But I did see in the earlier comments, like some people were noting about the scenarios, about being able to indicate the climate factors for risk. I see now I'm emphasizing where they are in their roadmap. That's very important to show kind of as you're moving forward and as your strategy might adjust to that resilience. We also found it particularly useful that they noted the material climate related risks and opportunities here. So when we're talking about strategy, that's really what we want to know. We want to know what were those risks and opportunities that you identified to have a financial impact on your organization, and then using those scenarios to reflect the resilience of the organization's strategy. So you can see that they note in the risk and opportunities impact, for example, the climate factor of consumer preferences. They note that there might be a change in consumer preferences, which could have a change in sales due to new or lost customers. So those of you who are struggling sometimes with the quantification of this financial impact, that's a great example of how they've noted, okay, we might not be able to give you the exact numbers of quantifying this, although many organizations are moving into that direction. And as you enhance your data, you can reach that point. But at first, just saying, oh, this will have a financial impact because it will change our sales volume. So some improvements that we thought could be part of Vodafone's continuing journey as they move forward is to provide a bit more of a narrative of how strategy has addressed climate risk and how these risks and opportunities inform financial planning. So the strategy focuses mostly on impact and identification. So it's missing here kind of details on how it's addressing these main risks and opportunities that it's identified. So just to give you an example here, so CDL provides a very concise description of the strategic mitigation or adaptation being undertaken. So you can see, their biggest column there in the middle is the strategies that they're going about. So this is just important to note that in the strategy component, it is a process, so you'll be somewhere along that line. But once you've identified a risk or an opportunity to be material and why it's material, it's important to know what you're doing about that as an organization. Has that impacted your strategy at all? How are you ensuring your resilience? What's interesting here is they also note kind of what regions that's applicable to and what parts of the organization that's applicable to. So for larger global organizations, that can be particularly important. And here we have just another example of a way to kind of look at your strategy and how you're reacting to these risks and opportunities. So they listed kind of the major risks, the time span, which, as we've indicated, short to long term, you're going to have to indicate what that means, in how many years are we talking, and then their main initiatives of how they're reacting to that. And one more example on strategy, we discussed earlier how maybe it's not going to be quantified. Vodafone was kind of listing in a qualitative manner how they've identified a financial impact, whereas Meridian here does show a quantification in dollar amounts of particular top risks. But what's important is with that quantification, they provide a methodology underneath. So that's another example if you're a bit more advanced that you could use. And just because we're talking about financial impact, I like to throw this slide in here, but I'll just leave it for you to look at on your own and point you towards these really good guidance documents. So the metrics, targets, and transition plan guidance 2021. It has two appendices, Appendix 1 and 2, which can help you with identifying your financial impact. And then also the 2021 implementation guide. Oh, sorry, it's in the implementation guide, Annex 1 and 2. It's in the metrics and targets, section F, I believe. It's specifically on financial impact. So those of you who are at that stage where you're really trying to determine what is the financial impact of the risks and opportunities you've identified, these are really great resources for you. So finally, we have Sunway. Quite a few of you are looking at that too. And some notes is a lot of you thought, they do a really good job linking it to these kind of global goals, the SDGs. They talk a lot about their kind of broader goals as an organization. And, a few of you noted that they're kind of a leader in the region as well. So that's a really good point that we noted as well. A few of you said maybe some interim targets would have been good to see, some scope 3, absolute emissions, year-to-date progress, all of those. Yeah, definitely. It would be nice to see that. One thing I'd like to know as well, it makes it clear the connection to the global goals here. It hasn't addressed on this page specifically why these targets are important to the organization. So we know that these targets, these goals, the SDGs are important to society at large, to the environment at large. But what impact does that have on your organization specifically? So what is the strategic reasoning behind working towards these goals? So I think more of a link to the organization's risks and opportunities would be important. And then, as someone else mentioned, also progress over time can be very helpful as well. So here is one example of that connection between the metrics and targets and the risks and opportunities that we've identified. So as we've said, all these elements should be connected and consistent. So this shows that, we've identified that some of the climate related risks are, for example, extreme weather, and particularly, the risk of flood. And how are we now aligning that with our metrics and targets? And progressing over time. So that's just important to make sure, coming from the UN, the SDGs are very important, making sure you're making it clear why they're important to your organization in particular. So with that, we're coming to the end. So we want to give you a few additional resources. And Davide, can I throw it back to you to take us through our resources?
Of course. Thank you, Tiffany. There's a wealth of more specific, more in-depth resources focusing on certain sectors, certain areas. We highlight here a few which have been developed over time, which can help you further your work in climate-related disclosure and TCFD disclosure. The accounting for climate will be really useful to understand the connection between the financial reporting and climate-related reporting and how these can be integrated. The building blocks guidance, should you use CDP already, will help you gather the information that you might need, you will need for TCFD disclosure from your CDP disclosure already. The ever-present TCFD Knowledge Hub, there is a wealth of information there. We'll see in a moment that there's further courses that you can use, but there's also very useful tools that allow you to benchmark your company against other companies and check the reportings and find more information, more detailed on specific topics. And of course, we cannot forget the model guidance on climate disclosure, which will be and has been the basis for this, one of the bases for these courses, and will be really useful. I'm passing on now to Ralitza from the IFC, who will take us through the disclosure and transparency program.
Thank you, Davide and Tiffany. And I just want to say that IFC as well, disclosure and transparency is very important for us, both as an investor and advisor in in emerging markets and alongside other investors that are investing with us. We are actually currently looking into and will publish our first impact report as an investor. And one of the information that we're really struggling is exactly on climate-related issues, because in order for us to say how much is the contribution toward the SDGs, how much is the reduction that we have contributed through our investments on carbon, we need the information and the data from you as well. So for that purposes, we have developed a set of resources both for policymakers and for companies with different examples on how to disclose on strategy, governance, and performance. And we are enhancing them now, working both with CDP and UNSSC, doing some practical tools for gap analysis of annual reports, more resources on climate, and looking into future in biodiversity and other areas that are extremely important. So if you're looking for a progressive approach on how to move from better to good and best international practices, I advise you to look into our resources and also get in touch with our people in the region, as IFC has offices in all the countries and active programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralitza. And just to take you through the further steps that you can take to increase your knowledge about TCFD disclosure and the climate-related disclosure more large, we have what we call the TCFD 102E, which is a self-guided online learning platform on the TCFD Knowledge Hub, which will allow you to have more specific courses, more specific focus on certain areas, having a deep dive on aspects that you would like to explore further that we might not have covered here, or even having a review of what has been discussed here a bit more, maybe even a bit more in depth. It will allow you to gain an applied understanding of TCFD, have further case studies, further examples, and it provides you with ongoing resources. We are updating it constantly, and so you will find that the resources available to you will increase and will allow you to further your knowledge in a self-led way. The courses currently are these, but more than these, there are other courses that have been added about biodiversity, about other specific topics, climate-related important for accountants. You see here. We have water-related disclosure, for example. We have specific dives into governance, financial risks. And again, even if you want to go to the basis, you can go back to the introduction to climate-related disclosures and understanding the recommendations. These courses are CPD certified, and you can find them on the TCFD Knowledge Hub.
Great. I might just actually move to the end and then hold there, so we only hold up people who actually have questions to the end. So just a reminder, please fill out a feedback survey. You can see that link in your chat box now. It'll also be emailed to you, so check your junk mail if you don't receive it. That's how you get your CPD certification. And I believe the last week's certificates are coming out soon. So just keep an eye on your junk mail for that. And with that, just wanted to give a big thank you to Bloomberg Philanthropies and IFC for their financial support, and to Bursa Malaysia for coordinating this training event. And you can find all the contact details on this slide. The slides will also be available now in your chat box. So we're gonna pause here for the last 4 minutes, just in case any questions come in. We're here for you. Otherwise, thank you everybody for being with us here today, and we've really appreciated your interaction and your great questions. Do remember to take any links you need from the chat box now before we close, so that you have those resources. The slides also have hyperlinks, so anything that appeared in the slides will already be in the slides. Have you seen any questions, Davide? I have not.
Not at the moment, no. Thank you everyone for participating in the meantime. It's always a pleasure.
Lots of thank yous. Thank you back, everyone. Okay, I think we're clear. I don't see any questions, so I think we gave them a bit of a chance. You have our contact details. If you need our help with anything, please just reach out. Thanks, Ralitza. Thanks, Davide. Thanks to Ariana and Rita also for providing all the background support. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.